freedom, and any kind of freedom, is not just a freedom from, but a freedom for. So I just want to discuss, what does religious freedom from mean? Well, as the bishops point out, religious freedom from interference and coercion. There is indeed a separation, as we know, of church and state. But that doesn't mean that church and state don't in any way collaborate or have a relationship. It just simply means that they are distinct powers and jurisdictions. The bishops point out that even though we have this, if you will, separation, or I would rather say distinction between the church and state, it doesn't mean that there's a contradiction with us being Catholics and being Americans. Our faith, the bishops say, exhort us to be good citizens of this world and to work with others toward the common good. To be religious doesn't mean that we have to be less of a citizen in a democratic society. Right? We are both Catholics and Americans. But because of this distinction between church and state, we do know that religious freedom means that we are free from the state coercing individuals to believe in a particular religion or act or worship a particular way. But it also means that the church does not have a role to legislate in government. There is a distinction, and there are distinct powers and jurisdictions. The church is not to legislate the government. The state, the government, is not to define or prohibit religion. It's important to keep in mind, and the bishops remind us of this in this document, that religious freedom is more than just simply a religious freedom for worship. And that's the second part here. It's a freedom from something, but it's also a freedom for something. Religious liberty is a freedom for worship, obviously, but it's not confined only to worship. You may begin to notice among some of our politicians the use of the phrase, instead of freedom for religion, they'll say freedom for worship. The bishops are clear to point out that that's never been Catholic teaching. It's a freedom for religion, not just simply for worship. So we do have this freedom to worship, to gather as a community of believers in celebrating our faith, and also we have the freedom for acting according to our faith with others in our society for the common good. All right, so that's, again, fundamentally what religious freedom is. It's a freedom from and a freedom for. Now, as you'll notice, under number 1 and number 2, there are kind of risks that are outlined here that I just want to point out. There is a risk today that the secular state is becoming a sort of religion. And it's, if you will, interfering with and even defining what a religious institution is. And it's imposing its own ideology on those who might believe differently. So that's one of the risks that seem to be happening today, and it's limiting our first most cherished liberty. And then secondly, the risk today is also that religious liberty is being reduced or limited to freedom of worship, as I mentioned, as if faith was entirely a private matter or a matter that's simply confined to the sanctuary of the church, that we can only be religious in a certain place, in a certain context. But we can't take that religion into our family life, into our public life, into the public square. So Joe, if you'd go to the next. This next slide is a quote taken from the Second Vatican Council and its declaration on religious liberty. The human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men, the Council says, are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that in matters religious no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed. Thus, it is to become a civil right. And again, 1966, really passed in 1965, this Declaration of Religious Liberty. And it's rather helpful for us even to this day, and especially in these days. So, religious freedom is something that we have that's inherent to who we are as human beings, and therefore, I would add that religious liberty can never be the subject of an accommodation. The state doesn't accommodate our religious liberty. It's demanded of good government to recognize and defend a right that we have as human beings. The state doesn't confer religious liberty on its citizens, simply recognizes what has already been given to us by our Creator. So at any time we deal with an accommodation for religious liberty, that begins to tell us that the state is beginning to interfere with religious liberty. Okay. So let's move on then to the next slide, if you would. Thank you. The next part of this document, the bishops highlight some of the, if you will, attacks that are present in our society against religious liberty. And they're found at three different levels: the federal level, the state level, and local level. I think it's so important for us to realize that the threats are not simply limited to the contraception mandate. Have you heard it called that? Right? That in and of itself is simply not true. It's not just simply a contraceptive mandate. It also deals with abortifacients. It also deals with sterilization. And it goes beyond even the requirement for insurance companies. It also gets into the mandate itself begins to define what religion is. And that's also something that's an attack on religious liberty. But it's not just that mandate that has been problematic in recent history in the United States. And I think it's important for all of us not only to be informed about some of these threats, but also to be continually looking for ongoing encroachments on religious liberty. So, at the federal level, the bishops point out that there is this health and human service mandate that I think most of us are familiar with to some degree. And that is the demand that certain products considered to be preventative services, which are contrary to the Church's moral teachings, it's being required that Catholic institutions pay for them through their insurance payments. And at the same time, the health and human service mandate narrowly defines the meaning of a religious institution. Because that mandate says that you can get an exception for the mandate if you fulfill a certain criteria. And I don't know who it was, but one of the bishops commented that narrow criteria established by the mandate is a criteria that even Christ and his disciples couldn't fulfill. Right? It's so narrow. It's so narrow that a diocese can't fulfill it, Catholic hospital can't fulfill it, Catholic university can't, and I'm beginning to doubt whether even an individual parish could ever fulfill it either. So that's just one threat at the federal level. Another threat, of course, which was rebuked by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 9-0, amazing, they all agreed on this, a 9-0 decision, in which the Supreme Court overturned a governmental attempt to define who church ministers are. So that was out there, I think it was from Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, and that was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, there are several state laws that the bishops point out are also a threat to religious liberty. In Alabama, most people don't know this. I didn't know it until I read this document. But in Alabama, the Catholic bishops have a suit against the state of Alabama due to an immigration law, which makes it difficult and even impossible for a minister, a Catholic priest, to minister to an illegal immigrant. It's not possible, according to this law in Alabama, for a priest to hear the confession of an immigrant who's illegal, who's an undocumented person, no matter what country they're from. And so the bishops have complained about this law, and they now have a lawsuit against the state of Alabama, simply because it's not possible, according to the law, for a priest to hear confessions, celebrate Mass, even anoint someone who's dying if they're an illegal immigrant, because it's considered to be cooperation with an illegal immigrant. There also have been several attempts in the past, particularly in the state of Connecticut, in which the state legislature was imposing civil structures upon church government and trying to redefine legally how a parish and how a diocese is structured in order to fit into their own kind of categories. That, of course, was rebuked. There are also threats that are ongoing in various states with regard to Catholic foster care and adoption agencies. Some people may not know this as well, but in Boston, San Francisco, the District of Columbia, and in the entire state of Illinois, the Catholic Church is no longer providing adoption services. Do you know why? It's because those areas, those particular states, have made it so difficult for the church to carry out her mission that the state no longer licenses them. Because these individual dioceses have said that if we're going to involve ourselves with adoption services, we will not place a child with a same-sex couple, nor will we place a child with an unmarried opposite-sex couple who are cohabitating, because we don't think that's a proper environment for a child. And because of that fact, the state has removed from Boston, from all of the dioceses in Illinois, Washington, D.C., have removed their ability, their license, in order to engage in adoption services. In those areas, Catholic Charities continues its good work, but in this particular area, they are no longer able to help couples adopt children. And then finally, at the local level, there are several threats. The bishops point out two of them. They point out the fact that the University of California has failed to recognize a religious group for many, many years. There is a Hastings College of Law, which has only one group has been denied student organizational status. In this Hastings College of Law, which is under the University of California, they have refused to recognize the Christian Legal Society for many years. Why? Because the society requires its leaders to be Christian. Now, tell me, what's so difficult to understand about that? Right? The Christian Legal Society requires its leaders to be Christian, requires them to abstain from sexual activity outside of marriage. Isn't that amazing? And because of that fact, the university, through the Hastings College of Law, refuses to recognize them. Also, at the local level, certain Christian churches, not necessarily Catholic churches, but certain Christian churches are not allowed to rent public schools on weekend for worship services, even though non-religious groups can do so for a whole host of other reasons. But religious groups aren't able to rent public schools. So, these are some of, as I said, some of the attacks that are outlined by the bishops in this document. Joe, we go on to the next one. The bishops then go on to point out that we have a very proud and long history of religious liberty in the United States. And I just have briefly put up here on the screen 3 different examples of 3 very important founders of our country. The first, of course, is Lord Baltimore, who established Maryland as its first colony before it became a state. And in that colony, he accepted people of different faiths in order that they could live together. He established Maryland so that other faiths could live together in peace with one another. And his whole vision in 1649 was codified in the Act Concerning Religion, which is considered to be the first law in our nation protecting religious liberty. And then George Washington, of course, was very much in favor of religious liberty. There's a quote up there from him: "The establishment of civil and religious liberty was the motive that induced me to the field of battle." And then finally we have in Thomas Jefferson this little quote: "The principles of the Constitution are," he says, "a sure guarantee that a group of religious sisters would be free to govern itself according to its own voluntary rules without interference from the civil authority." So once again, the bishops are pointing out that we have this long and very cherished history of the promotion and defense of religious liberty in our country, just from a civil point of view. Okay, Joe, the next. The next screen here just outlines some of the things that the bishops have said about how various faiths have come to the defense of religious liberty, particularly following the Health and Human Service mandate. And I just include here 2 quotes from 2 different groups. Following the Health and Human Service mandate, a group of evangelical Christians and Catholics came together and wrote a statement called "In Defense of Religious Freedom." And this document quotes has a lengthy quote of that document in defense of religious liberty. And they say the following: "We, as evangelicals and Catholics, object to what we could call a naked public square. That is to say, a square that's stripped of religious arguments and religious believers. We object to that. We think that the public square ought to have within it, along with so many other voices, religious arguments, religious believers. But also, they say, and this is also important to keep in mind, we reject a sacred public square. That's also not something that we have in the United States, which gives special privilege and benefits to religious citizens. What we seek is a civil public square. That is where all citizens can make their contribution to the common good, whether it's citizens of faith or no faith." There was also a statement from the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations, and they too came to the defense of the Catholic Church's objection to the Health and Human Service mandate, and they said the following: "Many faiths firmly believe in being open to and engaged with broader society and fellow citizens of other faiths. The administration's ruling make the price of such an outward approach the violation of an organization's religious principles. This is deeply disappointing." So certainly the U.S. bishops are pointing out that there have been people of other faiths that have come to our help and need and recognize that this issue is not just about the Catholic Church. So if there's maybe two things to take away, it's not about contraception and it's not about the Catholic Church. It is about religious liberty. That's what we're talking about here. Okay. Then finally, I have here a little what I called a summons and a challenge from our Holy Father, Pope Benedict. You may recall the fact that our Holy Father has been meeting with Catholic bishops for several months in what we call the ad limina visits. They began in the late fall, early winter of 2011, and they continued through almost early spring of 2012. And he dealt with the issue of religious freedom because this was one of the concerns that the bishops brought to the Holy Father. And he said this, which I think is really key for all of us here tonight. Our Holy Father said, "Here once more we see the need for an engaged, articulate, and well-formed Catholic laity." I'm going to pause there, and I want all of you to ask yourselves the question, am I an engaged, articulate, and well-formed Catholic laity? We need you. The church needs you. You are the church, part of the church. And we need you to be engaged, articulate, and well-informed. Endowed, the Holy Father said, with a strong critical sense vis-a-vis the dominant culture, and with the courage to counter a reductive secularism which would delegitimize the Church's participation in public debate about the issues which are determining the future of American society. Listen to our Holy Father's call and his summons, his challenge for particularly the laity to be engaged at this moment. As George Weigel says, and that's the quote at the bottom, what is at stake here is nothing less than the future of civil society in the United States. So that's just, again, a brief summary of this wonderful document, our first most cherished liberty. I hope, again, you'll have an opportunity to look at this personally, go through it, hand it on to someone else, talk about it with others, and to really become a well-formed, articulate laity, an engaged laity in this particular issue. This fortnight of freedom is, in my mind, an opportunity to kind of circle the wagons, but not to circle the wagons to look in on ourselves, to circle the wagons so that we can go out and be that transformative light and leaven in our society, and making sure that the voice of all religious people, not just the Catholic Church, but all religious people, will continue to be respected and heard in our society.